Hey guys, so today we are going to talk a little bit about a subscriber question, and the question in question was, Frederick, when do I use the store, the Redux store more specifically, and when do I use just the React state? So let's get into it. Now this is a little bit of an open question, but I think I can give you a slight hint as to kind of how to think about using one over the other. Now it's actually funny because the distinction and, well, it's hard to say the proper use cases, but it's a little bit of a philosophical topic, if you will. But I actually did at one point get a job, like a job interview, correct, because well, at least from the employer's perspective, I could show very clearly that I understood the distinction between the two and share a bit of a thought process on the sort of considerations I want more people who work in JavaScript overall to, you should make these sorts of considerations, because it proves that you understand the problem that you are solving, and it also proves that you're not just using a library because it's the popular thing. Now let me explain. You see, the first thing I want us to touch on is, let's take a step back from React, forget about all of that stuff, and ask the most fundamental question when it comes to JavaScript and UI development overall. What is the biggest problem, or rather one of the biggest problems just generally considered within JavaScript development? Well, I will make the argument that one of the biggest problems that you have is to manage state. Now that's not news to people who are working with JavaScript or have been doing this for a while. If anybody has tried to make a sophisticated JavaScript application in either just vanilla JavaScript or jQuery or something like that, you will know how difficult it is to show the correct state and make sure that each component on your page is actually showing the data that you want. So that's one part of it. Now what people usually do in order to solve this sort of issue is to have some type of variable or some type of object that basically holds the state either for the component or for the entire page, and then that's going to be your state management system. That's the old way of doing things. Now the problem here is that this works very nicely if you have a single dimension to the state dependency. In other words, if you only need to hold the state and for one component, or only one component needs to be aware of its own state, this is very neat, this is very easy. However, the problem comes when multiple components are interdependent on each other. In other words, one component needs to be aware of that another component state has either changed or it's been updated, something like that. Now, when that happens, when you get that interconnection, that's when the real problems start for most people, and that's where all of these things like observables and all this stuff that we have tried to kind of use in order to figure out how to actually manage this interconnection, that's where this is coming from. So let's tie that back to React Land. So what did I just say? In order for you to solve a single component state, it's a very simple and very old and proven technique to simply hold a representation for that single component, or even for the whole page, as long as it's just something that holds the state. That is literally the state interface. That's how the React state interface is pretty much meant to be used. It's something that you can use in order to hold a component level state. In other words, it's something that is completely private or to the component in question and all of its children, everything that it can pass down if it needs to actually pass it down to somebody. The store, however, is a global thing. It is something that can be shared across the whole node tree in a React application. And that's where the actions, like in Redux, come into play. The reason why you have this convenience, you may not reflect on it so much, of sharing that state across all the nodes, is because if you have a component that holds an internal state and you have another component that is not a direct child of that component, it's very hard for that other component to know when the state has changed. So if you're typing something, how will the component know what the state is? How do you share it between the two? That's where Redux, the Redux store comes into play, because due to the action dispatching system and the forcible re-rendering of these components and passing through this global store, or this global state, if you will, you can now make each component aware of the global state changes. And that message dispatching is the strength to this flux system, or the Redux system. So I will argue that that is what you should consider. In other words, if you have something that is truly internal to a component, a good example of this is a form, or whether or not a dialogue, a modal or something like that should be shown, or if it should be hidden. These sorts of things that doesn't really concern or doesn't really need to be shared across multiple components, that's a very good fit for the state. While things that need to actually be shared across multiple components, you might have data or state changes within one component that needs to be communicated to other components in order for them to behave correctly. That's a very good candidate for the store. There's one more thing that you should consider as well on top of this, and that is the life cycle of the state. In other words, if you use the state interface for a component, that state is gone when the life cycle, or the lifetime of that component, is over. In other words, if you say switch the state so that the component gets unmounted from the page, you lose that state. However, if you want to have a way of persisting the state of that component beyond the life cycle of the component in question, that specific instance, you can also use the store, because the store will live for longer than the component. So an example is, you have a form, the user fills out some information, you close the form. If you use the state, when the form opens again without being submitted, you're not going to have the state. However, it's likely that the state isn't going to happen and be persisted. However, if you use the store, you can fill out the information, close the modal, close the form, open it again, and as long as you haven't cleared the store of the state, you will still have that information. So what I want you to take away from this is that although this is of course not a silver bullet rule or anything like that, it's just something that I found to be a very good and fairly helpful distinction to make. Generally, the way that you should think about using the state versus using the Redux store is, the state is very useful to use for local state, things that are local to just the component and all of its its children. The store is very useful to have if you need to share state between other components, and if you need to persist a state beyond the life cycle of a component. Have a great day.